Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, December 2nd, 2025, and our dear friend John Helmer is here with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me back, Nima. Good to be here.
Please hit like button, helping us reaching more people. John, let me start. We know that Steve Witkoff is in Russia to talk and to meet with the Russian officials, basically with Vladimir Putin and his administration. And
Hmm.
here is the latest news that comes from Russia that the main goal of these meetings of Russia wants to resolve the conflict for generations. It Peskov said.
Yes.
And what does that mean in your opinion? Because the war in Ukraine, many people are criticizing the war in Ukraine that has lasted too long, and they're taking a lot of casualties on both parts, Ukrainians and Russians. And what is the point of the continuation of the conflict? And putting the military motives, military issues aside, politically, what does that mean when Peskov says we want to put an end to this sort of conflict for generations?
It's a very important point Peskov's just made, and I can say that for our audience, it's 5 minutes past 2 in the afternoon in Moscow, so it's 5 minutes into the meeting that Vitkov has having with President Putin in the Kremlin right now as we talk. Peskov's statement was made about an hour ago in Delhi, in India, to brief Indian journalists ahead of the arrival of President Putin on December the 4th, on Thursday. And Putin will be there on the 4th and the 5th. The question that Indian journalists have put to Peskov is the one that everybody listening to us is asking. And we don't know yet what will come out of the Vitkov meeting. The question is, we've seen the 28-point Miami plan. We've seen, without the details, the 19-point Geneva plan. We've seen that shortened to pointless plan in Abu Dhabi, and we've seen the recording or the reporting of Vitkov and Kushner, Junior Kushner, talking with Rubio to the Ukrainians in Miami and several times over in the last few hours. So the question that arises is, the question that Peskov was answering is Russia ready to do a deal to simply suspend the fighting, take a pause, and prepare for the resumption of war later on? Is that what this negotiation of those several American plans was all about? Is the American offer to keep Ukraine in fighting shape, to continue the war? That was the question the Indians were asking, because they asked me. I was in Delhi last week. It's a question of, is this a short-term solution or a long-term solution for Russia? So when Peskov says at roughly the same time as Vitkov shows up in the Kremlin to present the latest plan, this is for generations to come. This is an end of war settlement, not a pause. That's the first thing. Second, to settle for many generations to come, let's look at the precedents here so that we can judge whatever comes out of Vitkov's mouth, whatever's leaked by him or by Kushner or by others in the Trump administration into their press. What are the precedents for peace for generations to come? Well, remember how World War I ended. The war to end all wars did it? And look at the Versailles Treaty precedent. Let's just look at the way in which the precedent for ending the conflict with Germany in 1918, and later the ending of the war with Japan and the ending of the war with Germany in 1945. What are precedents? What standards do they set for judging whatever pieces of paper, whatever terms Vitkov brings Well, first, um, the there's there's what you could call the de jure versus the de facto issue. Russia insists that this must be a peace for generations to come, right? Now, that means that there has to be international recognition, starting with the United States, including NATO, of the Russian territories, Novorossiya, the Donbass, that's Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Crimea. It must be de jure. Why? It must be a matter of law, international recognition. Why? Because if it's merely de facto acceptance, it's an invitation that Ukrainians and their supporters in the West will foster for years to come for taking it back. So de jure is the standard. In Versailles Treaty, Germany lost territories it did not regain except by an attempted war between 39 and 45, and then it lost them for good. Lost them for good. So what's de jure must be accepted international recognition. That's the first thing. This is not a ceasefire. It is a legal law-binding settlement. The second thing we remember from Versailles, from the end of the Japan War, end of the German War in 45, there must be caps on the military capabilities of the Ukraine. The Russian side have been saying from the beginning, there must be demilitarization. Everybody understands that's the first of the objectives of special military operation. What that meant at the end of the World War I, in the Versailles Treaty, was that Germany could not have an army larger than 100,000. It could not have submarines. It was not allowed to have naval vessels over 10,000 tons. Demilitarization in the Second War against Germany meant complete disarmament, total demilitarization. It meant for Japan a limited self-defense force inserted into the Japanese constitution. Now, everybody out there knows that the Japanese are busy trying to undermine their own constitution, expand their army, and do so with Trump's encouragement. Yes, that's happening. But what I'm saying is a bit different. The standard for now, the standard for the agreement that is being discussed as we talk, must be this precedent. Demilitarization meant that for the defeat of Germany. It meant that for the defeat of Japan. And it meant that for the defeat of Hitler's Germany again. Now, that's demilitarization. And if you don't implement it, you have war again. The denazification of the Ukraine is the third element. You can very well understand that whoever succeeds in Kiev must agree to remove the basic racial hatred of the Russians, the discrimination against the language, the discrimination against the culture, the discrimination against the church. All these measures in law that have been implemented since 2014 have to be removed. Otherwise, you have another generation growing up hating the Russians and wanting to go back to war, with plenty of support from the CIA, MI6, BND in Germany, and so forth and so on. So denazification is the third standard for creating what Peskov's just described as a settlement for solving our security problems for many generations to come. Now, there are two other points, big points, in the plans that we mentioned, the plans we discussed last time with you, Nima, that these are the so-called business, lures, the business opportunities that are buried in points, mainly point 14 of the Miami plan. That's where the American side, but principally Witkoff, Kushner and the other business people in the Trump family and around the Trump administration have sought to privatize Russia's sovereign bank assets, the 300 billion, taking 100 billion and applying it into a profit-making investment vehicle in the Ukraine, and then taking over the other 200 billion in a so-called Russia-US development fund run by people like Kushner or Kushner, Vitkov's sons, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary's sons, so forth and so on. That's an astonishing, unprecedented privatization of sovereign assets. It was done to defeated Germany, defeated Italy. The Americans came into with the Board of Control Commission, the Army Commission that took over Italy, for example, and they began to privatize Italy's assets, but Italy was defeated. Germany was defeated in war. Japan was defeated. That's the privatization of sovereign assets proposed in the Miami plan of Russia, Russian CBR sovereign reserves. That's extraordinary. It's never happened before. And if it's tried, what will happen is a very significant Russian backlash. Now, that leaves economic warfare. For the solution, as Peskov has just said, the security problems for many generations to come, the Americans have got to, and the Europeans have got to stop waging economic war. That's what sanctions are. And yet the Miami plan, hatched by Vitkov and Kushner, was to lift sanctions or relieve sanctions on a case-by-case basis. Case-by-case means, in the English language that Vitkov and Kushner uses, bribe me and I'll see if I can fix it for you.
Yeah. John, how yesterday we had the meeting between Emmanuel Macron and Zelensky. Emmanuel Macron is talking about, why are we talking about the corruption in Ukraine? How about the corruption in Russia? You know what's so amazing to me, that when we talk about the corruption, you cannot find a single country on this planet without corruption. It exists in all of the countries. But what the main point of the corruption in Ukraine is the way that Ukraine is receiving a lot of money from the Western, the collective West, and is the corruption is happening in the process of receiving and spending that money. This is the problem with Ukraine. And why do they need to turn it seems that somehow trying to manipulate the whole issue with the corruption in Ukraine, which in my opinion is the key to put an end to the conflict in Ukraine, because this is a huge process of, a some sort of, system has been made in Ukraine, that money goes in and a lot of people, benefiting from the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine. That's one of the core issues in Ukraine. And why do they need to go after Russia instead of addressing what's going on in Ukraine in terms of corruption?
Well, nothing Emmanuel Macron has to say about the war makes almost any difference now. The man is fighting to survive as president of France, more unpopular than any president in living memory, who needs to continue the war, both to support his military constituencies and to divert the attention of the Assemblée Nationale and the public opinion, and trying to continue to rule by executive order. We've talked about that. Macron needs a war in order to rule by executive order. That's what he does. And whether he talks about fighting corruption in Russia or not, it is irrelevant. He will find the excuses and he will find the justifications, but he will not expose French forces, French units, to counterattack by the Russian side and have to explain corpses coming up. That he will not do. So it's a big mouth um, facade for solution of domestic problems. But you made the more important point. What's the meaning of the counter-corruption, anti-corruption drive in the Ukraine? Well, we've also talked about this before. Part of the current corruption scandal comes out of the efforts of Biden administration, Soros Foundation, and U.S. intelligence services to remove some Ukrainian individuals on corruption charges while keeping others in place, in power, and under control. Obviously, we all know that the Biden family itself was corruptly engaged in the Ukraine. Hunter Biden's particular relationship with Igor Kolomoisky and some gas exploration companies operating in the east of the Ukraine. This story is well known. I told it in Dances with Bears in great detail, the so-called Burisma corporate scandal in which Hunter Biden took money years ago. But the scale of the corruption being uncovered now is relatively small compared to the scale of the looting and corruption that's been administered from the top from 2014 on. Administered, that is to say, by those heads of government put in place by the allies, starting with Petro Poroshenko and ending with Vladimir Zelensky. Those people are overseeing hundreds of billions of dollar value corruptly redistributed through the National Bank of the Ukraine into the Ukraine private banking system, in which Kolomoisky was an expert at diverting. That was multiple billions of dollars, far more than the recent corruption alleged to be around Timur Mindich. Why then is Andrei Yermak now under investigation for corruption? Well, but not Zelensky, and not any of the circle that Yermak has put in place around himself, including, I believe the man's name is Oleg Tatarov, his deputy, who has not been accused of anything. I mean, this is a system of corruption, and everybody's complicit in it, all the way up to Zelensky. So when it has particular targets, one understands that this is a political scapegoating operation designed to evict one individual and replace him with another. It's a form of succession crisis. Okay, many podcasters will say it's the beginning of the end of the Zelensky regime. Well, that remains to be seen. I've said, and we've said it on this program, that I can't claim to have good Ukrainian sources anymore. I can recommend that our audience read Peter Korotayev, who publishes a Substack column called Events in the Ukraine. His latest, I think published yesterday, looks at the downfall of Yermak with a question mark. What is happening, why it's happening, what are the consequences for the others who remain. Clearly, Yermak is as complicit in this massive corruption as Zelensky. Zelensky's removing Yermak, a target for years and years by factions in the Ukraine to lessen Zelensky's power and replace him. Why haven't we heard from the far right or the Azov nationalists, people like General Beletsky, for example, who is in the running for control of the general staff, and the general staff will be controlling the president pretty soon, if not already. Well, at the moment, Zelensky controls the general staff, but in present conditions, you've got, pardon me, contenders like Zaluzhny, the former chief of the military staff, who sits in London, We've got Kirill Budanov, the head of military intelligence. You've got Beletsky, the head of the nationalist or Azov or neo-fascist forces. All of them are potential contenders for having a role and power, access to money and arms after the settlement. So removing Yermak is removing a person in the road to blocking their ambition. But whose ambition will be satisfied? Who will emerge from this struggle under the Ukrainian rug? We don't know at the moment, and I can't pretend to know better than Korotayev. Oleg Tsarov, who's an important Ukrainian presidential figure currently living in the Crimea, sees this as the downward slope of the beginning of the end of the entire Zelensky regime and the capitulation of the general staff. He sees Yermak's removal as the beginning of the end for Zelensky. Korotayev isn't so sure. I think it would be folly for us viewing at this distance to say which outcome. But we are saying corruption is a smoke and mirrors game. It's making scapegoats out of political targets who are slated to be removed, to be replaced by others equally corrupt.
Yeah, I think that's the point. But what Russia is talking about, that Zelensky is not the official president of Ukraine,
Yes,
that could be the issue, John. Whoever signs the document, any settlement, that's the issue. The next president would come and say, I don't agree with, with the
correct.
previous. Yeah.
And for that, the provision in the settlement agreements requires elections within a certain number of days from the signing of agreements. Free and fair elections is a joke in the Ukraine, but a defeated Ukraine is going to express itself somewhat differently. Of course, it's half the population of Ukraine than it was back in 2014. But yes, the Russian position is Zelensky has no legitimacy as a president. He must be replaced. The martial law by which he rules must be lifted. There must be no further mobilization, and elections must be held but 100 days, 90 days from the signing of a settlement. And from that election would come a potentially constitutionally legitimate authority capable of signing an agreement. Whether it has the sufficient power to enforce the terms of agreement on renegades, people who intend to fight Russia for the next 100 years, remains to be seen. Therefore, it's not just a question of the legitimacy of the succession of elections. It's to put in place demilitarization provisions, supervision provisions. And I mean, I can wave this at you. I'm looking at, I can't quite. This is the annex to the April 2022 agreement that was formulated between the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. And it sets very clear limits on how many forces the Ukraine army will have. The Russian side said 85,000. The Ukrainian side said 250,000. The tanks were to be limited. 800 tanks the Ukrainian side wanted. 342 was the Russian number. I'm reading from the annex. Armored vehicles, 2,400 the Ukrainians wanted. Just over 1,000 the Russians proposed. And then there were particular limitations on the range of rocket and missile systems. They've all been overtaken by the war. I can read you, for example, here. Ukraine undertakes not to develop, produce, acquire, or deploy on its territory any type of missile weapons with a firing range of more than 280 kilometers. Well, we now know they have a range of up to 1,000 or more. So to implement anything comparable to the agreement that I've just held up, April 2022, the restrictions have to be tighter. But everything we've been told since the Miami 28 points is the restrictions are softer, lighter, until they're non-existent. Well, so you have to have legitimacy of elections. You have to put in place a genuinely democratic government, but that government will not have the capability to attack Russia, to continue the war. That's it.
Yeah. Zaluzhin yesterday said that he argued that the post-war security guarantees for Ukraine could include NATO membership, stationing nuclear weapons on Ukrainian territory,
Nuts.
and bringing in a large foreign military force capable of confronting Russia. John, going through these, cases that he has mentioned, NATO membership, we know that is not possible. But how nuclear weapons, I don't see anybody would be willing to do that.
Correct.
The United States, Europeans, not. But how about a foreign military on Ukrainian soil to defend Ukrainians? What does that mean? Who's going to provide that? Who's going to be acceptable for Russia
No,
to
no.
be
Well,
in Ukraine?
uh, there are a stack of different plans and proposals. You're quite right. And in the, if I'm not mistaken, the proposals submitted, tabled by the Russian side back in June 2025 in Istanbul, provides that no foreign force may be deployed on Ukrainian territory. No foreign force. I mean, I'm looking again at the 2022 provisions because they were there then. It was a case of the Ukraine would not have NATO elements, US elements, advisors, intelligence sharing systems, missile crewing jointly with foreign troops, foreign technicians, and NATO elements. It's what made Ukraine a de facto NATO warfighting platform against Russia has been defeated and is being defeated on the battlefield. Right? We accept that. Zaluzhny doesn't. Syrskyi doesn't, the current commanding general, and the others do not. They want to fight on. Fine. If they want to fight on, there's a Russian solution for that. President Putin has said it, and all Russian officials understand it. The confidence is there that if the Ukrainians don't agree to the Russian terms now, they will be wiped out. In other words, that there's demilitarization and live, or demilitarization and die. Those are the two options. The rest is fantasy offered by potential contenders to come back into power, like Zaluzhny. Well, what more can I say in answer to your question? We will see.
Zaluzhny, John, after all, Zaluzhny is important because he may be the next president of Ukraine, or maybe a crucial point, a key point, a key, position in the future Ukrainian government.
Well, he may be, but he's not going to have access to the kind of warfighting material, the army. Remember, if I'm not mistaken, the Miami plan said 600,000, set a cap of 600,000 Ukraine troops, modified within days in the Geneva plan to 800,000, and then the Abu Dhabi version had no limit at all. I mean, why did I begin with a Versailles precedent? Because the defeated don't dictate the terms. Because if we're to have peace for generations to come. We remove the source of insecurity the Russians have been trying to deal with first by treaties of non-aggression in December 2021, and then by war. So and now by negotiations to end the war. They're the stages we've passed through. Now we're at the stage where Mr. Vitkov is sitting in the Kremlin across the table from Mr. Putin, Mr. Ushakov, Mr. Lavrov, and who knows whether Mr. Dmitriev will be there or not. The point is that they are trying to come to a framework of agreement to address the root causes of Russia's insecurity, taking into account that at considerable expense of blood, Russia has defeated everything NATO put on the battlefield in the Ukraine warfighting platform. And that's being defeated. If defeated, they must understand the precedent of Versailles is disarmament, demilitarization, the incapability to resume fighting next generation.
John, yesterday I was talking with Paul Carrick-Roberts and Larry Johnson. We were discussing the way that Vladimir Putin has decided to fight the war in Ukraine. Two sides, and they didn't agree on the way that Vladimir Putin has decided to do it. When it comes to Russia, considering Russia, we know that Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000. Russia was devastated with the government, with the Yeltsin government, and how desperate the economy was in those days and how devastating the situation was. He came in 2000. Until 2010, he was somehow, he was busy with the conflict with Chechnya.
Mm-hmm.
And the economy wasn't doing great in those days. He was reconstructing the economy, improving the situation in Ukraine, in Russia. Then, in 2014, we had the coup in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at what has happened during the years, was Russia in a position in 2014 to intervene, to just go in Ukraine just to avoid the coup in Ukraine? Do you see Russia was prepared in those days to confront the West?
Oh, well, that's two questions, really. The war against the West is very old. It's 100 years old, since the Bolshevik Revolution. It's passed through several stages. And pardon me for our audience if I'm repeating myself. The Allies, including Germany, were prepared to attack the Soviet Union, Stalin's Russia, until Hitler went alone. And Hitler went against the Western Allies. Russia proposed non-aggression treaties with the Czech Republic, with the Poles, with the French and the British. No, they continued to have they regarded Stalin and Soviet Russia as their principal enemy, not Hitler's Germany. The defeat by Russia with the Allies of Hitler's Germany allowed the resumption of the older plan of attack on the Soviet Union. And it's called the Cold War, but the battle plans including atomic annihilation of the Soviet Union until the Soviets developed their own nuclear capability to deter the Americans from implementing those plans. We know those plans. Daniel Ellsberg published them. So what then happens is that the Soviet Union recovers its power to deter, and we go through a phase of peripheral wars, like the war in Afghanistan, created by Zbigniew Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter, and pursued by the Reagan administration. Even when the Soviet Union wanted to withdraw, it was considered an effective proxy war that bled the Soviet troops until Gorbachev pulled them out, and until the Reagan administration felt it had bigger fish to fry, bigger stakes in accommodating Gorbachev than continuing the war in Afghanistan. Now, many folks now claim credit on the podcasts for advising Gorbachev and then advising Yeltsin in the period where the war against Russia became purely economic. They claim credit for advising Gorbachev and Yeltsin. They don't count the millions of Russians who died on account of the destruction of the Russian economy during the Yeltsin period, the so-called privatization period, from which millions and millions of Russians died premature deaths because of the collapse of the medical system and the social welfare system and income support and so forth. President Putin comes in at a time when there's a combination of methods for destroying Russia, one of which you mentioned, the Chechen wars, or the attempt to have secession in the Caucasus, was another method for breaking up the Russian Federation, and was bloody on both sides, and ultimately defeated by President Putin. Thus, as the internal security improved, that let's say option of internal covert warfare, proxy warfare, was replaced by external border proxy warfare. Georgia and the war of 2008 is an example. But by then, you remember President Putin is warning NATO at the Munich Security Conference, if I'm not mistaken, it was 2007, that the Russian side recognized that NATO not only intended to move east, but intended to move east offensively, aggressively, and create war-making platforms, including the one in the Ukraine. Your question was, could Russia have intervened to stop that then? Was that your question? And it's a good question. And there are many who say, they're not podcasters who get invitations to Moscow recently, that President Putin delayed for too long. And that delay, issuing red line warnings and then allowing the red lines to be crossed, delaying preparation for resisting the fortification of the Ukraine as was going on visibly. There are many who say that in Russia, and many who believe they're right. Now, what happens in 2014 was the "we told you so" moment for President Putin. He was, as you recall, preoccupied with the Sochi Olympics at a time which seemed a happy time for Russia. But at that time, we now know the US was planning a putsch in Kiev and staged the Maidan demonstrations, which led to the provocative killings, which led in turn to the attempt to impose an elections schedule on President Yanukovych. And then overnight, after that had been signed by the Ukrainians, by France, Britain, and the United States, if I'm not mistaken, with the observer from Russia, that agreement, Poland, France, and the UK signed that agreement. Russia observed it, and then the Allies simply went back on their signatures, and the putsch occurred. That launches a new phase of the war to destroy Russia, right? And this one is what we are now seeing in its defeat. The Ukrainian warfighting platform is the present stage. It's being defeated. Could President Putin have succeeded in February 2022, for example, in the special military option that was designed to trigger a, a counter putsch in Kiev, to trigger a change of regime and a change of orientation in Kiev. That was the plan. The operation of Russian special forces at the Battle of Gostomel, the Battle of the Antonov Airport, was designed to stimulate such a counter coup, such a counter putsch. But it failed. It failed disastrously, and most of the special forces were killed. At that point, we now know the Russian side agreed to the opening of negotiated terms negotiations in Istanbul, and that produced the draft treaty that I've held up. We can go on, but basically, it would be fair to say that there have been moments when a different approach might have succeeded, but it didn't. Mistakes were made on the Russian side, mistakes that have been costly, and there have been lessons learned from those mistakes. And that's one of the unique things about the Russian side, its capability to accept that there have been mistakes and learn from them. It oughtn't to be a propaganda doctrine to say that Russian side doesn't admit its mistakes. It has admitted its mistakes. Here we are now, and there's a considerable apprehension in Russia that it would be a mistake to allow Trump to dictate terms to Russia for settlement, because Russians don't believe the Americans are credible. Now, the most recent poll I've seen, approximately a month ago, identifies the United States as a bigger enemy than the Ukraine itself. More Russians think America is the enemy than think Ukraine is the enemy. Why? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? So the Russian public opinion is beginning to shift. Public opinion, Russian people, normal people, understand a great deal more about the mistakes. They don't want to suffer them themselves. And there's been a recent shift in the poll ratings, both for President Putin, slightly downwards, but for the Prime Minister Mishustin, significantly downwards, 11 percentage points, and for the other organs of government. Public opinion weighs the evidence they see of negotiations on the one hand with the Americans, the principal enemy, and on the other hand, the advance of the Russian army. Public support for the president is highly correlated with the performance of the Russian army. The Russian army is what public opinion in Russia has confidence in. So there's a very serious apprehension that any agreement with the enemy on terms that undermines the victories on the battlefield of the army, there's a very serious apprehension that such a mistake could be made again.
John, shifting the gear to the conflict in between the United States and Venezuela, Donald
Yeah.
Trump, he was when candidate Trump, he was talking about the policy of regime change before coming to power. He was
Yes.
talking about Soros. Then they came to power. They talking about removing USAID because USAID is spending the US money on in foreign countries to you know to do regime change, all of that. And right now, Donald Trump, what he's doing is literally aligned with what Soros was trying to do in Venezuela for such a long time.
Yes.
How do you see? They're talking about the new leaks of Pentagon documents shows that Donald Trump is planning to stay there. Harassing Venezuela and being in Caribbean, in Caribbean for up until 2028, if I'm not mistaken. What is that with Venezuela? How do you see the situation with Venezuela, and how do you, separate the policy of Donald Trump with what we've seen so far from Soros and his people?
Well, again, I take the view that the evidence that is being pumped out by the Trump administration, for example, the tweet calling on all airlines pilots. I'm reading, I was shuffling papers a minute ago so I could read this stuff as the evidence to answer your question. Trump's tweet of November 29 to close the air. Please consider the airspace above and surrounding Venezuela to be closed in its entirety. That's not a no-fly zone order. There's no Pentagon, U.S. Air Force backup to enforce a no-fly zone. Were that to happen, that as an act of war against Venezuela, the self-defense capabilities, including anti-aircraft missile capabilities, would be activated. From what I can see of the evidence, and maybe I'm mistaken, Trump wants to provoke, add pressure, add threat, because that's the sort of extortion racket he and his family and his friends and his backers operate. And yet, when I'm looking at his last remark, the minute he faces a serious question or a serious deterrent on the ground, he backs down, he backs away. November 30th, I'm looking down at my notes. You can find the exact text in rollcall.com. Trump was asked, can you tell us more about why the airspace above Venezuela should be considered closed? And then he answers, yeah, because we consider Venezuela to be not a very friendly country. They sent millions of people, really, probably a number in excess of that. And a lot of those people shouldn't be in our country, from jails, from gangs, from drug, goes on. I mean, this is not an answer to the question. Then does your warning mean and drugs? He says he's not listening to the question. Does your warning mean, this is your question, Nima, that an airstrike is imminent, or should we not read it that way? Trump, don't read anything into it. Well, don't read anything into it. What's that mean? It means I'm not threatening an airstrike. I'm threatening everything else, but not an airstrike. I'm inviting pilots and airlines to abandon flights to Caracas. Okay, it's completely unlawful, but he can't enforce it. So we know that when I looked it up before, preparing for today's program with you, Nima, I looked it up. Emirates has suspended its flights into Caracas. Lufthansa has suspended its flights into Caracas. Lufthansa and some others are using code share arrangements with half a dozen Central American or Latin American airlines. Volaris is one, COPA is another. They're so unfamiliar to me, I'm not even pronouncing their names correctly. Nonetheless, President Maduro has responded, as you know, by saying any airline that accepts Trump's threat and complies with this new, it's an economic sanction, not a military one, really. It's an economic sanction made to look like a military one, only the military won't be enforcing it, will lose its permits and licenses, which will be awarded later to other airlines. That's what's happening. So I would say it's a Trump bluff, a classic Trump bluff. He is unable to, I'm sorry, there's a fire or a police car going past. He's unable to trigger regime change. Like you said, the Soros idea of covert operations stimulate demonstrations against the regime of Mr. Chavez and then Mr. Maduro. When they fail, when the candidates that they put up fail. Trump has escalated the level of violence, all under this sort of war against drugs. That persuades nobody. It achieves nothing except violence. And so he escalates without using the fleet. Yes, it's got build-up of forces in Puerto Rico, in Trinidad, at sea, build-up of air and marine capabilities, and so forth and so on. And I'm told, as we talk later today, there's to be a White House meeting at 5 o'clock with Stephen Miller, the arch defender of all the fascist slogans of the Trump administration, Wiles, General Kane, and Secretary Hegseth. So are they deciding to invade or attack Venezuela? That's what the agenda appears to be. And maybe they will decide to act. In my own view, they will decide to cover their non-action or inaction, to cover this scheme of threats, as you said, scheme of threats to drive Maduro out of power that will go on for years. Can he withstand it? Yes, he can. Will the public opinion in Venezuela, public support for the defense of Venezuela withstand this sort of pressure for years? Yes, they can. Will the no-fly zone scheme work? No, it won't, because like everything else, there's a workaround, and these minor airlines will find it increasingly profitable to work around the threat for no fly in Venezuelan airspace. So I believe Trump is always in retreat when he is faced with significant deterrent capability that threatens his political base at home. That's what he does. The problem is that when he becomes too violent, too aggressive, and too threatening, his retreat has to be camouflaged. So the problem becomes how to camouflage the withdrawal of the fleet without an invasion. Can they pack up and go home without floating ashore? And what we've described before is the Bay of Pigs threat, the threat that if they try to attack physically Venezuela, they will run into more effective defense than they can count on destroying.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being with us today.
Well,
Great
it's a big
pleasure,
news
as
day.
always.
Where we're signing off, we've seen it's 56 minutes into the White House meeting, and so there's much to be discussed very soon after we finish, sure, and next week too.
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you for having me, Nima. Thanks.
My pleasure.